Let's be honest, most games play it safe. Same mechanics, different skins. But every once in a while, I play something that makes me stop and go, yeah, this is doing its own thing. These are 20 games that don't feel like copies of anything else, even years later. Okay, let me be honest with you. Echo is one of those games that quietly messes with your head, and you don't even realize it until it's too late. On the surface, it looks like a sleek sci-fi stealth game set inside this insanely beautiful palace that feels endless and cold at the same time. But the real twist is this: the enemies literally learn from you. If you sprint, they start sprinting. If you use guns, they start using guns. If you hide, they learn how to hunt. So every mistake you make comes back to punish you later, and suddenly you're second guessing every single action. I remember moments where I just stood still, afraid to do anything because I didn't want to teach the enemies a new trick. That tension feels personal, like the game is watching you learn and unlearn habits in real time. The story is quiet, mysterious, and a bit lonely, and honestly, it fits perfectly with the gameplay. Because Echo isn't about power fantasies, it's about restraint, patience, and feeling genuinely outsmarted by the world around you. It's not for everyone, but if it clicks with you, it really clicks. Driver San Francisco is one of those games that sounds completely insane when you explain it out loud, and somehow works perfectly anyway. You're playing a driving game, but instead of just racing or chasing criminals, you can literally jump your mind into other cars on the road. 1 second you're controlling a sports car, the next you're a truck blocking traffic, and then suddenly you're a police car ramming your own previous vehicle. And no, it never stops feeling cool. What makes it special isn't just the mechanic, but how confident the game is about it. It leans fully into this surreal, dreamlike idea and builds entire missions around it, turning driving into a puzzle rather than just a test of speed. The city becomes your toy box. I still remember how creative some missions felt, forcing you to think 10 steps ahead while hopping between cars at full speed. It's playful, weird, and surprisingly smart, and to this day, I genuinely don't understand why more racing games didn't take risks like this. Driver San Francisco feels like a developer saying, let's just try something wild, and somehow nailing it. The Stanley Parable is the kind of game that makes you laugh, then immediately makes you uncomfortable for laughing. It starts off simple. You're Stanley, an office worker, and one day everyone else disappears. A calm, very British narrator tells you what Stanley is doing, until you decide not to do it. And that's where the game really begins. Every choice you make, even refusing to make a choice, is commented on, judged, mocked, or completely unraveled by the narrator. What I love about this game is how personal it feels. It doesn't just react to your decisions, it reacts to your attitude as a player. Are you obedient? Curious? Annoying on purpose? The game notices. You'll find yourself arguing with a voice in your head, deliberately disobeying just to see what happens next. And somehow, beneath all the humor and absurdity, it sneaks in real questions about free will, player agency, and whether choice in games ever really mattered. It's short, it's weird, and it's unforgettable in a way most games never even try to be.
Experiences like the launch of the Stanley Parable on PC. You see, Stanley, doesn't the memory zone remind you of how wonderful Stanley Parable was before it was sullied with a cheap PlayStation port?
Next, we have one of my all-time favorite game, Mirror's Edge. A game that doesn't need nostalgia to feel special. It still stands on its own today. The first time you start running across those rooftops, something just clicks. There's no cluttered HUD, no constant gunfire, no endless tutorials telling you what to do. It's just you, momentum, and the city below. What makes Mirror's Edge unique is how physical it feels. You're not just pressing buttons, you're flowing. When you mess up a jump or lose speed, you feel it immediately. And when you get into that perfect rhythm, wall run, jump, slide, vault, it's almost meditative. The story is simple and kind of stays out of the way, which I think is the right choice, because the real narrative is movement itself. Very few first-person games trust the player this much. Mirror's Edge isn't about power or violence. It's about freedom, speed, and that brief feeling of weightlessness when everything goes right. Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons doesn't look like it's going to hurt you emotionally, and then it absolutely does. The idea sounds simple at first. You control two brothers at the same time, each mapped to one side of the controller. At the beginning, it feels a little awkward, even strange, but that's the point. Over time, your hands learn to work together without you even thinking about it, and the game uses that connection in ways that feel incredibly personal. There's no spoken language you can understand, yet somehow every emotion lands perfectly. Fear, trust, loss, hope. What really stuck with me is how the game turns controls into storytelling. Instead of cutscenes telling you how to feel, the game makes you do something, and that action carries emotional weight. When the story reaches its final moments, the way you interact with the controller hits harder than any line of dialogue ever could. It's short, it's quiet, and it's proof that games can tell powerful stories without saying a single word you recognize. Death Stranding is a game that asks you for patience, and I totally get why that turned a lot of people away. On paper, it's about delivering packages and walking long distances through empty landscapes, and yeah, sometimes it really is just that. But if you give it time, it slowly reveals something much deeper. What makes Death Stranding special isn't the combat or the story twists, it's the feeling of connection. You're constantly helping other players without ever meeting them, building roads, placing ladders, leaving signs, all for people you'll never see. And weirdly enough, that starts to matter. I remember crossing a difficult area and finding a ladder someone else left behind, and it genuinely felt like a small act of kindness. The world is lonely by design, and that loneliness makes every human interaction feel meaningful. It's strange, messy, sometimes frustrating, but also thoughtful in a way very few games dare to be. Death Stranding doesn't want to entertain you every second. It wants you to feel something. Immortality is one of those games where I honestly didn't even know how to play it at first, and that confusion is a big part of what makes it special. You're given clips from 3 unfinished movies starring the same actress, and your only real tool is curiosity. You click on faces, objects, words, and suddenly you're jumping through time, watching scenes out of order, slowly piecing together something that feels wrong. The more you dig, the more unsettling it becomes. There's no objective marker, no checklist telling you you're doing it right, and that's refreshing and terrifying at the same time. At some point, you stop feeling like a player and start feeling like a voyeur, digging into something you maybe weren't meant to see. What really stuck with me is how Immortality trusts you to pay attention. It doesn't rush you, doesn't explain itself, and definitely doesn't hold your hand. It's intimate, uncomfortable, and incredibly confident in its weirdness. This isn't a game you beat, it's something you slowly uncover, and once it's done, it stays in your head.
Detective Goodman.
Holly Honey,
Franny said you'd be coming.
would you be happy to answer a few questions?
Honey doesn't like cops.
Hellblade is not an easy game to talk about casually, because it goes places most games are afraid to touch. You play as Senua, a warrior dealing with psychosis, and the game makes sure you feel that struggle constantly. The voices in her head whisper through your headphones, argue with each other, lie to you, and sometimes help you when you least expect it. And it's not just a gimmick, it's exhausting in a very intentional way. Combat is heavy, slow, and personal, and the puzzles often mess with your perception, making you question what's real and what isn't. What I respect most about Hellblade is how serious it is about its subject matter. It doesn't glamorize mental illness or turn it into a cool mechanic. It forces you to sit with discomfort and confusion, and by the end, you feel like you've been through something rather than just played a game. It's intense, emotional, and deeply human in a way very few games ever achieve. The Last Guardian is a game that tests your patience in a way that feels almost intentional. You're not controlling Trico, you're working with him, and that difference changes everything. Sometimes he listens, sometimes he doesn't, and sometimes he just stares at something shiny while you're yelling at the screen. And yeah, that can be frustrating, but the longer you spend with him, the more you realize that's kind of the point. Trico isn't a tool, he's a creature with fears, instincts, and moods. Over time, you stop thinking in terms of game mechanics and start thinking like a caretaker, figuring out how to communicate without words. The world feels ancient and quiet, almost like it doesn't care whether you're there or not, which makes the bond between you and Trico feel even stronger. By the end, the emotional payoff hits hard not because of a big twist, but because you genuinely trust this creature. Few games have ever made companionship feel this real. Ghostwire Tokyo is one of those games where the setting alone already feels different, and then the gameplay doubles down on that uniqueness. Tokyo is empty, rain-soaked, and haunted by spirits pulled straight out of Japanese folklore. Instead of guns, you fight using hand signs, like you're casting spells through martial arts, and it immediately sets a different tone. At first it feels stylish and cool, but the more you explore, the creepier it gets. There's this constant feeling of being watched, especially when you're wandering through quiet streets with neon lights reflecting off wet pavement. What I liked most is how the game lets you slow down and just exist in this world, rescuing trapped spirits, listening to side stories, and soaking in the atmosphere. It's not perfect, but it's confident in its identity, and that goes a long way. Ghostwire Tokyo feels like a game that knows it's weird and fully embraces it. Heaven's Vault is one of those games that quietly earns your respect the longer you sit with it. At its core, you're an archaeologist drifting between ancient ruins, trying to piece together a lost civilization. But the real star of the game is its language. You're not given translations, you don't unlock a dictionary, you make guesses, sometimes confident ones, sometimes desperate ones, and the game moves forward whether you're right or wrong. And that's the magic of it. Your misunderstandings become part of history. I loved how it made me slow down and actually think about symbols and context instead of rushing to the next objective. There's something deeply satisfying about finally recognizing a word you once misread hours ago. The story unfolds gently, almost like a conversation with the past, and it never treats you like an idiot for not knowing things right away. Heaven's Vault isn't flashy or loud, but it trusts your intelligence, and that trust makes the experience feel personal and meaningful. Bully is Rockstar at its most playful, and honestly, we don't talk about it enough. Instead of criminals and chaos, you're thrown into a boarding school where the biggest threats are teachers, cliques, and your own reputation. And somehow, that makes it feel even more relatable. You're not trying to save the world, you're just trying to survive school life. What makes Bully special is how alive the campus feels. Classes actually matter, schedules exist, and every group of students has its own personality. One minute you're pulling harmless pranks, the next you're standing up to bullies who think they own the place. It's mischievous without being cruel, and rebellious without losing its heart. Even years later, there's still nothing quite like it. Bully feels like a snapshot of teenage chaos, captured in a way only Rockstar could pull off. Undertale is one of those games that completely disarms you by looking simple, almost harmless, and then slowly reveals how much it actually understands you as a player. At first, it feels like a charming throwback RPG with quirky characters and awkward humor, but the more time you spend with it, the more you realize the game is paying attention to everything. It remembers how you treat characters, how you fight, how you reload saves, and even how you try to game the system. What really got me was how it makes violence feel optional in a way that actually matters. Choosing not to fight isn't just a gimmick, it changes relationships, dialogue, and entire outcomes. And when the game calls you out for your decisions, it hits uncomfortably close to home. Undertale doesn't shame you, but it definitely holds up a mirror. By the end, it feels less like you played a game and more like you had a conversation with it, and that's something very few games ever manage to do. Far Cry Primal is the weird cousin in the Far Cry family, and I mean that in the best way possible. The moment you realize there are no guns, no vehicles, and not even a familiar spoken language, the whole series suddenly feels fresh again. You're dropped into a brutal prehistoric world where survival actually feels earned. Every weapon feels personal because you made it, and every encounter feels dangerous because there's no easy way out. What surprised me most was how immersive it became. The world feels alive in a raw, almost uncomfortable way. Predators hunt each other, tribes feel genuinely hostile, and night is terrifying in a way modern Far Cry games rarely are. It strips the series back to its core and asks, what if you really had nothing? Primal isn't for everyone, but if it clicks, it pulls you into a time and place no other AAA game has seriously explored. What Remains of Edith Finch feels less like a traditional game and more like being invited into someone else's memories. You're exploring a strange, towering house, learning about a family that seems almost cursed, and every room opens into a completely different kind of story. What really makes it special is how each memory plays differently. One moment you're reading a comic book, the next you're drifting through a dream, and then suddenly you're doing something so ordinary it becomes heartbreaking. None of these stories overstay their welcome, and that's important because the emotional impact comes from how quickly they hit and fade. The game never tells you how to feel, never pushes cheap drama, and somehow that restraint makes everything land harder. By the time it's over, you're left quietly thinking about family, loss, and the stories people leave behind. It's short, but it stays with you in a way that's hard to explain until you've experienced it yourself.
I'm not sure if she wanted to make it easier or harder. I wish we'd stayed.
Sifu is one of those games that refuses to be nice to you, and that's exactly why it works. You're going to fail, a lot, and the game doesn't pretend otherwise. Every time you die, your character ages, becoming stronger but more fragile, and suddenly every mistake carries weight. What I love about Sifu is how it turns frustration into progress. You start off button mashing and panicking, but slowly, almost without realizing it, you begin to read enemies, control space, and move with purpose. When things finally click, it feels incredible. Combat becomes this brutal, elegant dance where every move matters. There's no open world to distract you, no filler, just pure focus and discipline. Sifu respects your time by demanding your attention, and when you earn a victory, it feels genuinely deserved. Katamari Damacy is the kind of game that makes you smile before you even understand what you're doing. The premise is completely ridiculous. You roll a sticky ball around picking up random objects, and yet it works in a way that feels oddly perfect. What starts with paper clips and thumbtacks slowly turns into furniture, buildings, and eventually entire landscapes, and that sense of growth never stops being satisfying. The controls feel intentionally awkward at first, but once you get the hang of them, it becomes almost hypnotic. And then there's the music, which is somehow cheerful, weird, and unforgettable all at the same time. Katamari doesn't care about realism, logic, or trends. It commits fully to its absurd identity, and that confidence is what makes it timeless. It's joyful, strange, and completely unapologetic. And honestly, games like this are rare. Stray could have easily been just a gimmick. You play as a cat. But it ends up being much more than that. Moving through the world at a cat's height completely changes how you see everything. You're squeezing through vents, knocking things off ledges, curling up to nap, and all of it feels natural in a way that's hard to explain. The city itself is quiet, melancholic, and full of little stories, and exploring it feels intimate rather than overwhelming. What surprised me most is how emotional the journey becomes without relying on heavy dialogue or big dramatic moments. The bond between the cat and its robotic companion grows subtly, and by the end, it genuinely hits. Stray is calm, reflective, and gentle, the kind of game you don't rush through, because the atmosphere is just as important as the destination. Return of the Obra Dinn is one of those games that makes you feel like a detective in the truest sense of the word. You're not guided, not held by the hand. You're dropped onto a ghost ship with a notebook and a mysterious pocket watch, and it's your job to figure out what happens to everyone on board. Every death, every scene is frozen in time, and you have to piece together the story using logic, observation, and a lot of patience. The art style is so minimal yet striking that it somehow makes every detail feel important. I loved the way the game respects your intelligence. It never tells you the answers. You actually have to think, connect clues, and trust yourself. By the end, when the story clicks together, it feels like solving a real mystery. It's challenging, clever, and unlike anything else I've played, and that's exactly why it sticks with you long after you put it down. Disco Elysium is more like reading an insanely dark, hilarious, and twisted novel than playing a traditional RPG. And that's why it's brilliant. You're a detective with a crumbling mind, making choices, arguing with your own thoughts, and navigating a city that feels alive with secrets, politics, and tragedy. Combat isn't about weapons, it's about words, skills, and internal dialogue, which sounds weird until you realize how satisfying it is. Every conversation, every choice, even failing a skill check shapes who your character becomes. What I love most is how free it feels. You can be a compassionate hero, a drunken mess, or a cruel cynic, and the world reacts genuinely to all of it. Disco Elysium doesn't rush you, it doesn't hold your hand, and it doesn't apologize for how strange it is. But if you dive in, it's one of the most unique and unforgettable storytelling experiences ever made.
Enough about this. No.
You're too unstable to work for my boss. You're suicidal, Harry.
And that's the list. These games don't just stand out because they're different. They stand out because they commit to their ideas even when it's risky. And honestly, I wish more games had the confidence to do that. If you've played any of these, you already know how hard they are to compare. And if you haven't, trust me, they're worth experiencing at least once. Let me know which one messed with your expectations the most, or which unique game I missed. See you next time.